So in order to understand the pressure of the moment, in order to understand the crisis and the scandal of this moment, and understand what Joseph was contemplating, we really have to understand the law. We have to understand the law. A just man, which is what Joseph is described as, is someone who loves the law of God. To be a just person is to be someone who is law-abiding, law-keeping. And so we have to understand the law in order to understand what's going through Joseph's mind. In the law, it was required that a woman present herself honestly to a potential husband. In the law, it was required that a woman present herself honestly to a potential husband. And if she was presented as a virgin, but later found to have not actually been one, her husband was free to divorce her, and she could be liable to the death penalty. We see this in the law in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. There it says that if a husband finds uncleanness in her wife, and the presumption is there it's talking about sexual uncleanness, and that would include sexual uncleanness that had happened prior to the marriage, which was then came out in the marriage. It says he may write a certificate of divorce. Now, that's the law that ended up getting exploited by the Jews, turning it into, and if you find anything unclean in your wife, you can divorce her. She burned the toast too many times. That's it. That's unclean. Divorce. And so that's the situation that Jesus is dealing with in the Gospels when they say, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? He says, no, that's not the way it was from the beginning. And they say, but Moses said you could write a certificate of divorce. And Jesus says, yeah, but that was for the hardness of your heart, and you've been screwing this up. You've been reading into this. If you look at Deuteronomy 22, you also have a situation more explicitly about a man who's been given a wife, and she was presented as a virgin, and the husband goes and marries her, and then comes to believe that she's not actually a virgin, was not actually a virgin, and there charges can be brought publicly, ultimately against the bride's father as giving her away under a lie, under false pretenses, and that can lead to all the way up to a death penalty. It's considered absolutely scandalous. It's considered a kind of massive fraud. It's considered a massive fraud. This is because marriage is the building block of all human society. And pause, time out real quick here. This is one of those places where modern sensibilities cringe. I said at the beginning that we live in such debauched times, it's sometimes difficult for us to understand the intense trial that Joseph faced in this situation. And part of the way you know that you lived in debauched times, and part of the way you know you've been affected by the debauched times, is that when I say that a woman who presents herself as a virgin, who after the fact is found to not actually be a virgin, might be liable to a death penalty, if you're honest, part of you cringes. Right? I should make you raise your hand right now. How many of you cringed, right? Everybody cringes. Everybody does. That's how you know. That's how you know you're living in modern times. That's how you know you've been breathing modernism and individualism and all of it. Right? You've been fighting. I know, you've been fighting. But the fact that you say, but a death penalty? Seriously? Right? And this is how unbelievers and pagans have been getting Christians for decades now. You believe all that crazy stuff in the Old Testament about death penalties? And the Christians are like, well, but I kind of, maybe, I think, I don't know. Right? That's how you serve a bloodthirsty God. Right? That sounds barbaric. But that's the accusation. And Christians are quickly, have been panic flipping through the Bibles, trying to figure out some reason they don't have to. They've just taken the accusation and they've said, I don't know. Right? And some of the more honest ones have, well, maybe not honest, but I don't know, a different kind of dishonest, have started saying things like, well, this is why we need to unhitch the New Testament from the Old Testament. The Old Testament was, that was an old covenant. That was a different dispensation. That was whatever. They've got theological workarounds that don't make any sense to anybody, really. But they did a bunch of numbers on the board, and everybody's like, so we don't have to believe in the death penalty. Oh, okay. And they sigh relief, right? But When we see death penalties in the Bible, we should not be panicking, assuming that God screwed up. God did not screw up. God didn't have a bad day. God was not really, really angry for a few hundred years in the Old Testament. No. When you see the death penalties in Scripture, you ought to see flashing yellow, red lights. You ought to be seeing barbed wire around fences. You ought to see do not enter signs. God is saying, don't go there. It's destructive. Don't go there. It will destroy you, your family, and everything you love, everything that is good. Do not go there. If God says death penalty is a possible maximum penalty, he's saying what you're doing is destructive like murder. We ought to begin with that assumption. We ought to begin with that conviction. And this is because marriage is the building block of all human society. If there is not honesty and loyalty there, if there is not honesty and loyalty in the marriage covenant, then you cannot have loyalty and honesty anywhere else. You will not have it consistently. You will not have it long term. You say, well, I knew a guy one time and he committed adultery, but he was a really honest businessman. Right, okay, whatever. Right. No, it won't last. It won't last. You cannot have a culture of that. You cannot have cultures of adultery and then have cultures, societies, nations of faithfulness. You cannot. This is why adultery carried a possible death penalty. Unfaithfulness to the foundational covenant is a murderous attack not only on your own family, but also your neighbors and your nation. Unfaithfulness to the foundational covenant, the marriage covenant, is a murderous attack not only on your family, but also on your neighbors and on your nation. This is why a betrothed woman who slept with another man was also liable to a death penalty if she did not cry out to indicate her unwillingness. That's in Deuteronomy 22:23. So you have the scenario with the woman who's falsely presented as a virgin, who isn't actually. That carried with it the possibility of a death penalty. You say, well, they weren't actually fully married. Right. So, but in the same text in Deuteronomy 22, it addresses betrothed virgins. And it says that if she did not cry out, if she did not say, I don't want to do this. If she did not report it, if she did not cry out, if she did not resist, then she's liable to the death penalty too. It's considered adultery as well. We've been brainwashed into believing that sex is just a meaningless action between consenting adults. We've been brainwashed into believing that sex is just a meaningless action between consenting adults. But marriage and sexual union is the nuclear reactor of social and political life. Sexual union and the marriage covenant is the nuclear reactor of all social and political life. If your neighbor says he's playing with plutonium and uranium in his basement, you don't give him a pass because he says, don't worry, it's in the privacy of my own home. Right? No, don't worry, it's all in private. We'll close the shades. I don't care, right? What you're doing there in the privacy of your own home is not going to stay there. There's this thing called nuclear fallout. Have you heard of Chernobyl? Right? Or you're sitting on a plane and you ask the guy next to you what he does, and he says, oh, I run a nuclear power plant. And you say, oh, well, man, that's got to be intense. All the regulations and all the extra steps and protections and, yellow tape and all the things. And he just sort of shrugs and says, I just kind of wing it. I hope you don't just wing it. We're talking about lives. Marital and sexual infidelity never stays private. It never stays private. And we are living in the nuclear fallout of the sexual revolution. We're living in the nuclear fallout of the sexual revolution. We're living in it, which, incidentally, is the answer that you should have locked and loaded, ready to go, when somebody asks you, so you're like one of those Christians that believes in the Old Testament too? And you say, yeah. And they say, like, even the death penalties? And you say, yeah. And they say, you barbaric, backwards person. And you say, well, let me ask you something. Right? Ever since the sexual revolution, how's that working out for you? How's that working out for you exactly? Mass incarceration, mass crime, mass fatherlessness, mass drug addictions and overdoses, mass suicide rates. Oh yeah, and to top it all off, 65 million dead babies. Who are the barbaric ones exactly? Yes, I'll take the death penalty for messing with the building block of human society every day of the week. If it would save the lives of these babies, if it would save these families, if it would save these young men, if it would save our land. This is why God's law prescribes such intense maximum penalties. You're playing with explosives. You're acting like a social terrorist. You're acting like a terrorist to our land. You're playing with explosives.